Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for our clinical conversation today. We have Khadijah Harris here today. She's going to be talking to us about the disparities and effective culturally specific interventions in mental health among African American clients. So thank you for being here with us today, Khadijah, and we're excited to have you.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
I will do a little bit of our housekeeping logistics. I'll do some introductions. My name is Megan Mitchell. I am a child and adolescent therapist. I have my own private practice in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I do a lot of other different things. I also am the founder of Agents of Change Social Work Test Prep, and now we have moved into continuing ed. And then I am just months away from graduating with my doctorate in social work. So that will be added to the list very soon. And I have lots of different clinical interests. In my private practice, I work mostly with neurodivergent kiddos, so ADHD, autism, learning differences. And then in my doctoral program, what I am looking at, which actually pairs very nicely with what we're talking about today, is multicultural supervision, implicit bias. How do we, as someone that provides clinical supervision, how are we talking about multicultural issues and how are we best serving our clients? So that is another area that I am interested in as well. Here's a little bit about Khadijah. She is an MSW and licensed clinical social worker. She's done a lot of, I say this every time I introduce someone. Mental health professionals have done a variety of different things, right? We've had our hands in a lot of different things. So she has worked with foster care, family-centered treatment, and outpatient. Her work now is focusing primarily on the African-American community, and she's worked in foster care. She's been a social worker and family treatment clinician. She's the owner and CEO of NIA Counseling and Family Services. We were just talking a little bit about private practice, and she does virtual clinical therapy, coaching, and mentoring to African Americans in North Carolina. She specializes in Afrocentric therapy and person-centered holistic approaches using CBT, talk therapy, and works with anxiety, depression, and ADHD. She's deeply committed to decolonizing and destigmatizing therapy, ensuring that mental health care is accessible, culturally relevant, and empowering for her clients. Her practice emphasizes honoring the cultural strengths and rich heritages of African American communities, integrating these elements into tailored supportive interventions. So she's the expert here today to talk about this. My brain's already kind of turning because I just did that whole study on multicultural supervision and implicit bias and outcomes for minority clients. So I'm excited for our conversation today.
Love it. Love it.
Okay, some of our learning objectives. What are our 3 learning objectives for today? Participants will be able to identify systematic barriers. We are going to talk about what are some of those barriers for the African American community to access mental health. And that could be systemic. There could be cultural stigmas too that we will talk about. Applying culturally specific interventions. So she's going to talk a little bit about Afrocentric therapy and how we can be culturally responsive. And then lastly, promoting trust and inclusivity. So how as clinicians can we build trust with African American clients, emphasizing cultural humility? How can we decolonize the therapy approaches that are out there? And how do we acknowledge and probably address historical and generational trauma in the therapy session? So last thing is, why is this important? Health disparities exist. We know that for minority clients and African American clients. So we, as social workers and mental health professionals, are advocates for addressing these disparities. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Culturally responsive care. I feel like that's such a big emphasis in the past 5 or so years, is how can we make our practices culturally responsive? What does that mean, right? To actually do the work to be culturally responsive. And then breaking the stigma around mental health. So we're going to talk a little bit about, from Khadijah's perspective, how do we decolonize this work? It's very white male centric. We'll talk about, I'm sure we'll get into that. And then how do we kind of have a shift in our mindset to make sure that we're getting the best outcomes for these clients? So without further ado, I would like to welcome Khadijah, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the space to be able to talk about this.
Yes. So we kind of got the background right, and we're going to be talking specifically about how clinicians, how mental health professionals can work effectively with African American population. So how did you kind of hone your work into this being the specific area that you are focused on?
Yeah, so when I first got into social work after I got my master's, I was a foster care social worker, did that for about 3 years or so. And what I saw within that space was an overrepresentation of African American clients and kids within the foster care system. And with working with those kids, really seeing the mental health aspect of what they were dealing with and how that translated within that space. And then so that probed me to get my licensure. So then after I got my licensure, moved into family centered treatment, which is in the home, working with not only, the client per se, but the family system and the generational family system. And again, that was very much, an overrepresentation of Black families within that space, which then, once COVID hit, right, we weren't no longer going in the homes. So then I transitioned to outpatient therapy, and that's how I really kind of honed in on making sure that these African American clients and families really had a space for
Mhm,
therapy, just seeing kind of what they went through and also their experience with not feeling heard and seen
mhm.
from other clinicians who didn't look like them.
Yeah. And I mentioned a little bit in my doctoral program. I'm studying my capstone, the big research project that I'm doing is on virtual peer group supervision and like peer consultation, but from a multicultural lens. And how do we approach any clinician, right? How do we approach clients that are different than us? And how do we, because the research shows that all clinicians think they're so culturally humble and
Right.
culturally competent,
That's
right?
part of the program, right? You got to.
But when you look at the research, if you ask the clients, I believe it's a very high statistic. I believe it's 80% or higher of minority clients still experience microaggressions in the clinical setting. So does any clinician of any, race, background, identity, how do they address their implicit biases, and how do you bring that into the therapeutic relationship? So this is very interesting stuff to me, and you're not telling me anything new because I researched this, but there's some really interesting statistics out there for people that are interested.
Yeah, definitely.
So we'll just jump right in. What unique challenges do African Americans face in accessing mental health treatment? And what is in clinical practice? So now you had more of your, agency work,
Mhm.
foster care. What does that look like in maybe the outpatient setting?
So many challenges and so many different, categories of challenges that manifest in so many different ways. So first, and you kind of said that is stigma and cultural perception, right? So within the African American community, there's often a stigma around mental health and the challenges of mental health and those cultural beliefs that kind of discourage individuals from seeking help. And then as well as historical trauma, because the legacy, like you said, of systemic racism and
Mhm,
discrimination and that historical trauma have really created a mistrust between mental health and healthcare professionals and the African American community. So that kind of deters individuals from seeking support. Like you said, those economic disparities,
mhm.
right? If you are lower income, mental health is not a priority because you're worried about putting food on the table.
Yes.
There's also limit to access with mental health services. There's not a lot of, mental health agencies within low income areas.
Mhm.
Transportation can be an issue in getting there. And then also insurance, right? As far as that goes,
Yes.
and affording co-pays and medication, and it's a lot. Um,
I was just going to say, as someone that takes insurance or provider, it is challenging. Even as I take insurance myself, and I would say I probably have more knowledge than most people because I see the inside. piece,
Mhm.
I still have trouble figuring out my own insurance and what
Yes.
there's so many hoops to jump through and like, oh, we will maybe reimburse you. And it's
Mhm.
become very, even if you have insurance, it's very difficult to navigate.
Yes. And I feel like a big one as far as barriers that clinicians don't think about, and this goes into what you were saying as far as like how can clinicians kind of help with
Mhm.
that, is the over pathologization of behavior. So
Mm,
what that means is within clinical practice, there's a tendency to like misinterpret behaviors that are
mm,
typical within the African American community, right? So that can lead to a misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatment goals and plans. So, like for instance, within the African American community, look, you see me doing it a lot. Very expressive communication, right? Might be very loud, might be very animated, but that can be misinterpreted as like signs of emotional stability or
mm.
agitation, which can lead to a misdiagnosis like anxiety or mood disorder. Or if African American patients express kind of skepticism, about like the treatment plan or medication, it could be labeled as non-compliance,
I was just thinking resistant client. This is resistance. They're not bought into the process type of thing.
Exactly. And I saw that a lot within, the foster care, system, is if, those clients kind of resisted a little bit or had more questions, then that was, what was typed up that was put in is, the client was, non-compliant or, uh angry or different things like that. So again, those all play a part in that disparity, So it's very much needed to adopt culturally sensitive practices.
And this is just kind of a follow-up from what we were just talking about, but do you often see clients where you have to process these different instances they've had? Maybe they've tried therapy before and they're completely turned off by it and they're like, I was totally not listened to or supported. So how does that come up with your clients that you do work with? And do you have to unpack some of those things?
Yes, very much so. There's a lot of when I have clients who have went through the therapy process before, and they've had, white clinicians and just other races of clinicians, they're very hesitant a lot of times to get back into it, right? I've had clients who have said, specifically, they might have had an issue where they might have said something that was taken out of context and that might have led to a CPS report, right? Or different things like that. So we really have to process what my therapy process looks like and what they want to get out of therapy. And it's very relational. And I feel like
Mhm.
that's the key. I don't come to them as, the professional, so to speak. I come to them as very much, hey, this is your process. What do you want to get out of this? And really focus on, within the social work program, right? We rapport, build rapport, right? But it's very much that, right? It's like, how can I build a relationship with you that is honed in on trust, that is honed in on
Mhm.
personability, so that you feel comfortable within this space?
Yeah, and something that came up in my I'm glad that you brought that up. And something that came up in my research is that a lot of times if no matter, like I said, clinicians when they're working with someone that has a different background than them, they're
Mhm,
often scared to ask those
mhm,
questions, maybe if it's about culture or identity, because they don't want to seem incompetent, but that
mhm.
actually harms the relationship more by not asking, not being curious, not asking questions. um so that's a lot of it too, is you have to be self-aware as the clinician of
Exactly.
when do you ask a question, how do you ask a question, and asking feedback from your clients, like,
100%.
did this land for you, or was I completely off base, right?
100%.
It's their, at the end of the day, it's their process, but it's actually shocking how many people don't collect feedback from patients and clinician clients as well.
And I feel like, for a lot of clinicians within that space, like it might be uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
To ask those questions because it's kind of like the elephant in the room,
Yes.
right? It's like, okay, well, I don't want to make it a big deal if it's not a big deal type thing. So, But yes, 100% always ask, because a lot of times your clients are feeling the same way.
Yeah.
They don't want to say anything that's going to rock the boat, because there is a level, a power dynamic
Yes.
there. So they don't want to say anything to upset you, or, make you feel bad about the situation. So again, within that, ask the question so that they feel comfortable with bringing it up.
And I tell people that I'm supervising, I tell anyone that's new in the field, don't assume you know everything. You definitely don't. I always say the longer I've been in the field, the less I realize I know, right? I'm
Yes.
learning new stuff every single day. So don't make any assumptions, and let if you there is some sort of you do something that did not land for the client or it was causing some sort of issue, you can always repair the relationship. And that's just as important too, as making that repair.
Exactly. As long as you're open and honest, like, it can always be repaired.
Yes. So we're gonna switch gears a little bit. Tell me a little bit about your Afrocentric approach, and how do you incorporate this into your work?
So really within, using different things as far as Afrocentric. So the reason that I say Afrocentric, right, is because it really are those principles that help kind of bridge the gap for those African American clients. It, uses that cultural validity,
Mm,
identity exploration, right? Because within using that, you have to embrace their background and who they are in order to build that self-esteem, in order to build that pride, and help the clients really connect with who they are in order to make change, right?
okay.
And also using that, like you said, holistic healing, right?
Yes.
Incorporating the whole mind, body, and spirit within the healing process, because all of those are parts of the client that all work together to create the whole client, right? Once you treat them as a whole person, right? Saying, what they social, what is it that they say in school, the full body, the
Biopsychosocial approach.
biopsychosocial approach, right? Same thing, right? You're using everything as far as the whole client to address those emotional and the physical and the spiritual well-being. um Narrative therapy is also a really big one, because it encourages the client to kind of share their story right through
Yes.
their lens, and that also incorporates their, cultural history as well, and how that impacts them. So using that and kind of helping them shape that and reframing their narrative really kind of builds up again that healing.
And
And
how do you get into this? It's obviously a lens that you're working from, but how do you kind of get into this work? Do you start like asking some questions right away in the intake? Do you build upon it? Obviously, it's going to be different for everyone, but
Mhm.
how do you incorporate the Afrocentric lens into the work that you do?
So yep. So with my practice, and specifically, like, it is within the initial questionnaire. It has a
Okay.
lot of those questions in there. It has those questions of, what are your spiritual beliefs? Does that impact, what you need within therapy, right? What kind of trauma have you dealt with? And then I also include, within parentheses, cultural trauma as well.
Yes.
Right. So those are just all those things that are incorporated, straight out the bat, as far as within the initial questionnaire, to see again everything of who this client is and what they need within the therapeutic space.
And I ask that because I've had a lot of clinical conversations where I just talk to different providers, and a lot of intakes are very lacking, especially if you work in a big agency and you have to kind of follow the standard.
Hmm.
So I always like to ask, how does your identity play into your everyday life? So if you are someone that like does have some latitude to create or
Yeah.
advocate for intake policies, make sure you're asking questions about the person holistically versus
Mhm.
just, the standard check a box, because you don't get
Exactly.
much out of that. You'll get much more if they're targeted, pointed questions. And I always say an intake's a really good assessment tool, because from there you can see how little or how much information people are willing to give you.
Exactly. Look, you have to have those open-ended questions to get the answer because, if, like you said, if you just have a check a box, you're going to get the answer, but the context in which the answer comes from is going to be missing.
Exactly. And then that's also a skill you develop the longer you've been doing it, right? Like I remember when you're first learning, you have like those questions you're supposed to ask and you don't really go deeper. It's a skill that you build the longer you do it. You have to read the room, you have to read the client, and it's really a give and take. The more you do it of like, okay, I'm gonna go into here and explore a little bit more. But definitely something when I first started, I was like very much going by the questions that I was told to ask. I was very much green in the field at the time.
And I feel like that also goes within the concept of decolonizing therapy,
Mm,
right? Because the therapy approach is very medical, right? Which again, it's a health discipline, right? So to speak. So again, yes, you have the things that you need to know, right? Homicidal ideation, suicidal ideation,
right.
those type of things. Like, yes, you need to know, but
What
within
medication are you taking? Do you have a primary
exactly.
care provider? Yeah.
Exactly. But within decolonizing therapy, it very much takes the medical aspect kind of out of it and really puts the relational aspect front and center. Because I don't, and I have a lot of, coworkers and stuff. It's like, well, how do you get like the teenagers to talk? Or like I'll get like the difficult clients. And it's like, well, how do you get them to make progress? Because I don't force them to make progress. I literally just talk to them. And that talking, again, when you think of like building rapport, you may think of like, oh, half the first session, how's your day type. But really, my building rapport might take a month, right? It might take
Right.
even more than that, right? Because it's really about getting to know you as a person and caring about you as a person, not just in the aspect of, okay, let me say what I need to say and we move this along. It's really, okay, how can we really build a connection and a relationship that can help you?
Mm-hmm. And they can tell, clients can tell when you're trying to rush them through the process.
100%.
Um, I work with primarily children, and I have a lot of this is conversations I have to have with parents of they're not making progress yet. And I'm like, that's because they just met me 3 weeks ago, right? Are they
Right.
gonna really have a breakthrough in 3 weeks? That'd be wonderful, but that's not generally how things go. So I have to do a lot of I'm sure you have to do this too, a lot of psychoeducation around like honestly, like healing is not on anyone's timeline.
Yes.
It's a process. So I can't tell you in 4 weeks, like we're gonna meet all of our treatment goals and we're going to discharge. It's gonna be an ongoing conversation. We're gonna be
Mhm.
talking about it frequently. Like I want to make sure that they feel that it's a productive space as well.
Exactly. And like within that Afrocentric model, like understanding because you have like you said within kind of the Eurocentric model, right? Very individualistic, but you have to kind of move from that space and move into more community based and understand that you become part of their village, right? And you kind of become part of their circle of support, right? So I have clients who will, again, we have boundaries, right? But I have clients who will call me outside of their regular session time, especially parents, right? When I'm working with kids, it's like, hey, can you just speak to them? We're struggling right now. Can you just speak to them? And I'm like, of course, and because I've become part of their village to where if they're
Mhm.
having a tough time, they know like, okay, this is a person that one, the child feels comfortable talking to. We've built that relationship to where they feel comfortable talking and they understand that they can be honest, right? I'm not gonna ding my 14, 15 year olds for cussing. If that's how you feel like you need to express yourself,
Happens nonstop. That's
right. Like you say what you need to say and you say it how you feel it, and then we'll process it from there. Right now, you might not can say it that way to mom, right? We're gonna talk about how to appropriately express feelings, but if that's how you feel, then let me know. And then I've also built the relationship with the parent to where they know I can reach out and phone a friend within this tough space.
Mm-hmm. And I tell parents this a lot. They're like, why won't they open up to me? Or we have such a good relationship. And I say, think of when you were a teen. Did you
Mm.
want to tell your parents every single thing? No. Like, this is healthy that they're seeking someone outside That's not you. And that actually creates a boundary, which is good.
100%. Because I mean, parents, as a therapist, I have your best interest in my, at heart too. But parents, their goal is to stop you from doing stupid stuff, right? And
Right. It's
stop you from
different. You
hurting
have a different
yourself.
relationship with the child.
Exactly, because they know I'm not going to discipline them. you know,
Right.
I can't get you in trouble for, telling me what you need. Now we're gonna process it, right? I may, call you out for making a stupid decision. Like, why would you think that's a good idea? Come on now. But I'm not gonna get angry at you, right? And sometimes I have to tell my parents that too. It's like sometimes you have to step out of being guardian and parent and step into being mom and step into
Mhm.
being dad and sometimes just be there.
And that's a lot of times, this kind of gets into the intergenerational trauma piece, but a
Exactly.
lot goes into their own way that they were parented or not parented. And they could, I always tell parents, like, anyone could benefit from therapy, right? Because there's oftentimes a lot of times to unpack there of what is causing, what is guiding their parenting decisions, or what kind of household did they grow up in, because that does shape, if you're a parent out there, it does shape how our kids interact in the world and how they grow up.
Yeah, and a lot of times, they'll hear from other clinicians, and I hear this too from them. Oh, you probably think I'm a bad parent. No, you got your child therapy. You
That's
like
you, you made it in the door.
in a generation that you grew up in where therapy wasn't even a word, right? It was again 9 times out of 10 within the African American community, go to church, pray about it, right? It you got your child therapy because you understood that they needed help and they were struggling. This is a process that is new for both of you guys,
Mhm.
right?
And it can
Everybody's
be
learning.
scary. It can
Yeah,
be really scary to reach out to an outside person that that's never lost on me, is like the children, parents, anyone that puts their trust in us enough to take the step that, hey, I want an outside opinion, and I want to work on healing. That is huge. That is showing me, like you said, that you're taking the step in whatever way that is, for yourself, for your child, to change a pattern of behavior.
exactly. Exactly. 100%. Honestly.
Um, so we've touched on a lot of different things, but so providers need to know this stuff, even if maybe you don't work primarily with the American population. But what are some of the key things that you think need to be addressed or thought about from mental health clinicians about the systemic barriers, or just everyday barriers that African Americans might face and might be coming into your office with?
Yeah, so understanding that again, there are so many different aspects that systemic racism impacts regarding mental health, right? There's not just the direct stress as far as dealing with it, not just again, we've talked about the access to care, but
Right.
also understanding that, again, there's been historical injustice, like not just I'm not sure if you guys heard of the Tuskegee, syphilis
Mhm.
study, and there's also been the forced sterilization of Black women, right? Within, the civil rights movement. So there is a deep seated, you know, mistrust of the healthcare system, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, right? Being that the African Americans are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system, which creates anxiety, creates depression, creates PTSD, right? So again, there's a lot of different aspects that go into systematic, barriers that kind of, creates this system, and like different strategies that you can use to approach that, within the Afrocentric lens are again, like we talked about, cultural validation, right? Identity exploration, create the space for your clients and patients to be able to talk about these things without feeling like it's taboo, right? Using those strength-based, the strength-based focus, right? Using again the community and the collective healing, right? And also, I understand within the therapy space, you might want to keep, the spiritual separate.
Mhm.
But again, that is a huge thing for clients, right? If it is. So being able to acknowledge and incorporate the role of spirituality, whether that be Christian, whether that be Muslim, whether that be, Judaism, whatever it may be, letting them be able to utilize that within the therapeutic space, because if that's a strength that they draw from, it could help. And then also, that social justice framework and
Mm.
acknowledging those impacts of racism, oppression, historical trauma, and address how that is impacted.
I'm glad you brought that up because I'm thinking I have a particular client I'm thinking of that I worked with previously, but sometimes the therapeutic space might be the only place that they feel truly seen and safe to
Mhm.
express this. I'm thinking of an African American client that I worked with who was so proud to be from Ghana, but and it was a child, it was a
Okay.
young adolescent, but he said at school he never felt comfortable because he went to a primarily white school. He said people don't respect this or understand why I'm so proud to be from Ghana. So like he would talk about it in the space with me, and that was probably, other than home, one of the in community, was one of the places he could express himself there. He didn't feel comfortable doing that at school.
Yeah. And that's the thing, really using that, and again, if you're not, if you're not understanding exactly, African centered psychology, right? Again, kind of doing some research in it,
Mhm,
because, for me, again, using those African cultural principles, right? Not just like also, the Kwanzaa principles, right? Because those play a lot into, practice, but also, using the principles of like Ubuntu, which is like the belief in like shared humanity,
mm,
right? And then also the concept of into, which is also a psychotherapeutic approach that I use, which is a Bantu term, which again, it kind of translates to like essence, right?
mhm,
Belief in like harmony, balance, interconnectedness, and like authenticity within the space to promote healing. Um,
mhm,
and I use those as frameworks for therapy, right? Because again, it fosters that sense of balance. It fosters that sense of interconnectedness, not just with others, but within yourself, right?
mhm.
So again, using that client-centered approach.
And do you find, this could just be a one-off from my experience, but do you find some clients have not felt that they have spaces where they can express this? Like in the therapeutic space is one of those places that they're like, wow, I get to explore this in a safe place with you.
Yes, I've had, and I'm thinking of two clients in, specifically. There is a rise in, African American children who are being adopted into, white families.
Mhm,
So that, and a lot of times within that space, those families also live in a predominantly white, area,
mhm,
right? So it sometimes can create, those challenges of these clients not feeling like they have the space to be able to hone in on what it means to be African American, within, just life, right? And then again, I have
mhm,
these adult clients who again might be African American but living in a predominantly white area, whether that be for work or whatever it may be, or work in a predominantly white area. So again, they don't necessarily feel safe or comfortable with it, kind of speaking about that outside of this space, that we've created.
And I'm just thinking systematically, right? I'm thinking like schools. A
Mhm.
lot of the curriculum they teach is not Afrocentric, right? So you have to think of all of these different systems that a client lives within and the messaging that they're getting from day to day, right? Schooling is a huge one, right?
Yes.
That particular client that I was telling you about got, when they were talking about the slave trade, and he got very, very, very anxious and uncomfortable during this unit, and so we had to process that, and I actually had to connect with the school, and it was like a whole holistic thing, but that brought up a lot for this client because once again feeling like um the school was maybe not supportive of this student, or what are they going to think about me, and it was very interesting seeing it from a child's lens and how they were kind of part of this system, the schooling system, and how some of these conversations mom and dad had to have with this child at home about like this is what might be taught at school.
Mhm. Yes, and I have a client, who just recently, seventh grade, learning about the slave trade as well, and they're reading excerpts of Frederick Douglass,
Mm-hmm.
this for English class, and this client is African American, but again adopted into a white family, and I asked him, I was like, well, what was one thing you learned that you didn't know? So apparently the teacher told him, told the class, well, it wasn't just blacks who were slaves. Whites could be slaves too. White people were slaves too. It's not just blacks. And again, while that may be true in isolation, again, this is the first, he goes to a predominantly white school. This is the first, kind of piece of slavery that he's just now getting. And, he feeling like that's kind of, being, kind of taken away as far
Mm-hmm.
as really the experience. So now he's kind of confused about,
Yes.
what. So we really had to process that.
Mm-hmm. And we know that schools can be a power dynamic too.
Mhm.
So this client said, I'd rather just miss school completely, right? Because it was easier to avoid. So we had to talk about like maybe we can talk to parents about this, and then the school was actually incredibly supportive and great, but we had to have that conversation, right? But it's just interesting how sometimes we see some of those quote unquote behaviors come up. It's like, oh, lots of illness around times of this unit, like
Mhm.
I'm sick, I can't come to school type of stuff. So there might be some quote unquote behaviors, but that the behaviors are coming from something else.
Exactly. And that's the thing, again, goes back to, again, those Afrocentric principles of you're not going to be able to know what's going on with your client. One, if you aren't using those skills of cultural humility, if you aren't using that client-centered approach, if you aren't using those active listening skills, right? If you aren't adapting those theories that you're learning and adapting them to be client-centered, right? And so what if you can't build the space, the trust, the safety, and being able to receive that feedback, then you're not going to fully be able to help your client because you're not going to fully know what's going on with your client. And sometimes your client might not even know. You have to be able to ask those questions and dig deeper, right? And be able to be vulnerable in asking those cultural questions so that you can help them process that. And so both of you guys can reach the root of the issue together.
Mm-hmm. So, we touched on this slightly, but I want to get into it a little bit more.
Okay.
How does generational trauma shape the landscape or shape the experience for African American clients? And how might these come up for a clinician in practice? It might be they obviously come up, someone speaks about it, but just we're learning a lot more about intergenerational trauma, and a lot of people are not aware because it just has been the way it is. So how does it come up for you specifically with the clients you work with, and how do you address it?
A lot of times it again doesn't necessarily come up directly, right?
Mm-hmm.
It comes up through processing kind of past hurt, and it's like, well, you know, as they're kind of processing and as we're kind of talking about it, then they might bring up something as far as their mom or grandmom. So that's usually how it comes up. They don't necessarily have that connection um already, right? You got to kind of process so that they can connect the pieces. And a lot of times, again, that intergenerational trauma is a lot of, financial, right? Grandma didn't, grew up low income, mom grew up low income, again, just kind of doing the best they can. And within growing up, low income, there's not a lot of, emotional responsiveness, right? There's not a lot of, being in tune with your child and checking in to see how they're feeling and validating feelings, right? So that it can create a sense of like emotional disconnect,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which either translates to a person who is over emotional, right? Over seeking of, I need somebody to validate me, right? Or you have the opposite end of the spectrum and you have somebody who's just completely shut off from their emotions because they were never validated, right? So a lot of times those are the connections we kind of make when we see kind of those opposite ends of the spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And being able to not just process with them, but also with, again, if they're younger, being able to process with parent, if they're older, then being able to just help them make those connections so that they can
Mm-hmm.
understand fully.
And this is something that as you do more clinical work, you become more skilled.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily you ask a question and it comes
Right.
out. it's
Mm-hmm.
in the process. You're always, this is what I say, we're always collecting information. We're always putting
100%.
pieces together, which is why supervision and talking to someone to process these things is so important, because we are humans too. We are people. Sometimes we miss pieces. And like sometimes the most helpful things have been when I bring up a case in supervision and I'm just like, oh, I didn't think of it that way, right? Oh, wow. Like an outside perspective sometimes can just help us when we might be missing something.
Exactly. And look, the best part about, going through that process is when you get to a point where your client makes a connection that you didn't even think about. You're like, oh, so look at you making that
Those
connection.
are my favorite. That just happened with me a couple weeks ago. And a client, it was a teen client, and they said, I never thought about that. Like, and I said, when you see it, right? Like it just connects or it clicks.
Exactly. And again, you see a lot of it connecting as far as just, again, just the past and that intergenerational and how that impacts. Because even if something, again, didn't necessarily directly impact you, it has an impact on you, right? Because it has impacted how the people who have cared, for you and for your parents, it has impacted how they have come across and how they have cared. So it directly impacts you.
Mm-hmm. So, shifting kind of towards as we move towards the end of our conversation. So, what would you suggest if a client reaches out, and this is something as a white practitioner I think of often, that is an African American client? Do you should we this is always like the elephant in the room. Do you
Mhm.
ask if they'd like to see a provider of color? Like, how do you make sure that they're getting the appropriate fit for them? Not saying that I would not necessarily be the appropriate fit, but I want to make sure that I'm validating their experience and getting them the right person for the care that they need.
Well, asking off, like, did have they had any, previous therapeutic experience? If
Hmm.
they have, asking about their previous providers and what they got from that. Asking what they're seeking,
Hmm.
through therapy and what they need as far as a therapist goes, their preference for a therapist, and just kind of letting them lead within that as far as what they need. Um,
Hmm.
and just kind of going from there.
Okay. I really appreciate that, because I think of different settings I've worked in where like some are different populations, they have different makeups, right? And then it all depends on where you live too, geographically, right? Like there might not be access to African American
Mhm.
providers, but luckily with virtual there's a lot more options now.
Exactly.
But I think asking the question, I'm thinking of some clients I had that were African American, and um as they got older, parents and I had a discussion that like they were starting to explore identity a lot more. We said, you know what? I think it's the child did not specifically ask for this, but like clinically, and it worked out wonderfully. We thought that like as the child got older, it was really important for them to have a provider that looked like them and could help them with some of these as they're working through adolescence, which is already hard, right? So I think it depends. I think it depends, but it's like ongoing conversations that you have to have.
Exactly, and again, like you said, that might come out later, but also looking at really also the dynamic of the family, right? Because if you
Mhm.
have let's say a single mom and she has a son who's trying to go into therapy and there's some stuff that he's struggling with, and if there's, if you feel like, okay, within this system, again, they might not directly ask for it, but
Mhm.
again, if you feel like, okay, do you feel
Right.
like a black male therapist would be beneficial, right? Because if it's a single mom, then again, asking, as far as dad may not necessarily be in the picture, he may be struggling with things that, a black male therapist may be, more helpful with. So if you see things, again, not being afraid to just
Yes.
ask, right? You have to use that cultural humility and just be like, look, I may not necessarily be the best fit. Let me ask,
Hmm.
this is what I bring to the table. Do you feel like it could be beneficial?
Yeah. And I had something similar. I had a client come in and say, I wanted a gay male therapist. And I said, well, you can look at me. That is not me. And
Mhm.
asked all the reasons why. And right, there was lots of like, dad was not around. There was lots of reasons. And I said, and at this point, that was not someone, that specific person was not someone that was available, right?
Mm.
Like I said, mom and I will work to get you someone that's a good fit, but like, do you think right now, while we're working on getting you this other person, do you think like you would be open, right? I don't want you to be here if you're being forced to. And the client said yes, right? So I gave that client the opportunity to, try me out, right? But I called it out. I said, no, that's not me, right? And like, here is some things that I won't have because I'm not living in that body, right? So I think that actually helped that I called it out and I said, that's not what obviously that's not who you're seeing right now, but like, what were you hoping to get out of that relationship and how can we help you? And like, are you willing to work with me until we can find someone that's the right fit for you?
Exactly. And again, it may, like you said, may not be available within that space,
Right.
right? And that's okay. It's not saying that you can't help this client because of
Exactly.
that, right? But again, you have to be able to recognize your own biases and where not just, the limitation for yourself is, but also the limitation within the therapeutic space and the system may be in order to fully help this client using, the resources as far as culturally competent training,
Mm-hmm.
right? Being able to really, research, okay, what systematic barriers may this client be dealing with, right? Being able to look up, different social justices approaches and reducing stigma and using resources, because I use a lot of resources, videos, books, different things like that within therapy, using those resources but making sure that they are representative of this client, even something as simple as I used a video. I was working with like a 5-year-old and it was a little emotional video, like, and using like the five senses, right? So the
Yeah.
hand was going over the five senses, right? Something as simple as finding a video where the hand is also black, right?
Yes.
Little things like that really means a lot, right, to those clients to where they can see themselves, within this healing space.
Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad you brought that up because the physical space is very important and you want to make sure that there's representation in your space.
Hmm.
I do play therapy and I was in a different setting and there was only white dolls. And I'm like, so why, where is, and we had to do a whole complete kind of, I don't know, we went through and we like just decided like, what will this be appropriate for all of our clients? And we noticed like we should have different types of food, play food in the playroom, right? We should have different customary items for our sand tray. So we can oftentimes fall into this very like Eurocentric, westernized approach, but we got to be mindful so that we're breaking some of those habits. And it's not that we do it to be, cruel or anything like that, but you have to always, always, always be just mindful and going through that process of, and so just look in your office. Do you have representation of
Exactly.
other, minorities or identities? And would this be a space that anyone that walks in feels comfortable being in?
And even one big thing that I have found that really, resonates with specifically my black male clients, but also, females too, is having an emotional chart with, little black, boys and faces as far as representing those emotions. Because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times, and I say specifically black male clients, because again, we boys are the ones who typically have the struggle with recognizing emotions, right? And being able to express emotions. So them being able to see a face that looks like theirs representing an emotion and being able to point and say, yes, that is how I'm feeling, right? That is, they can see that physically, that is how I look, that is how I'm feeling. So again, just those little things to think
Yes.
about to be able to, again, help those clients and make those clients feel seen and heard.
And if you work with kids, there's actually checklists out there that you can like go through. Sometimes you just need like a little reminder of like, do I have these types of representations in my space?
Hmm.
Because what sometimes, right, we don't know what we're not like seeking to look. If you're not putting yourself out there or you're not doing the work to be reflective, you might have completely missed that, but that could make such a large impact in the therapeutic space.
Exactly. 100%. And make them feel comfortable with you.
That, and we know, like, research shows, yes, you can be trained in a trillion modalities, but the most important thing is the relationship you have with the
Exactly.
client. So if that relationship's not there, all that training and all those modalities aren't gonna matter.
100%. It kind of goes out the window because you're just following a checklist versus really caring about your client.
Exactly. So my last question we will wrap up with is, so this has been really, really informative. Someone that, maybe this is like, they're like, this has really opened my eyes. I want to like dive a little bit deeper. Where could someone start that is just trying to deepen their idea of how to effectively work with African American clients, or they want to learn a little bit more about that Afrocentric approach?
Yeah, so look, Google, right, is very helpful. Being able to look up, the mental health stigma around, just in general, different cultures, right? Being able to really understand what it means to be culturally responsive, right?
Mhm.
Again, there's and into psychotherapy is one of the only Afrocentric, therapeutic models that there really is. Again, we have right CBT, we have, EMDR, we have all of these different modalities, right? But really taking those and then researching how can I make this culturally responsive, because a lot of times those modalities were not tested with everybody, right? They were tested with most of the time white males, right? White females.
Mhm.
So again, you have to be able to look at those and being able to research, okay, well, where are the gaps within all of these things?
Yes.
Those therapeutic models are amazing, right? And they help so much, but you can't just take it and run with it, right? You have to be able
Mhm.
to do the research as far as, okay, well, how can I make this more culturally, responsive so that it can apply to everybody and so that it feels comfortable with everybody. You really using, when we say trauma informed care, right? It's not just physical trauma as in,
Right.
you may use it as far as somebody who's, abused, neglect, different things like that. It's really, it can be a mental trauma or cultural trauma, right? You really have to look into that, right?
Mhm. And that was something that I didn't actually realize until I was in my doctoral program, to take a critical look at research. I
Mhm.
just was like, it's research, it's good, it's great, it's done by important, smart people. But who are the subjects in research studies? So that has been very eye-opening too, of you will see a lot of these modalities were mostly tested on a very small sample size, and usually even socioeconomically it's upper middle class white males and white females. So and there's a lot of,
Going into these communities too, right? Even if you don't
yes,
currently have a client who may be, African American, just taking the time to go into these communities, volunteer, right? Go to like, maybe the church giveaway or the soup kitchen, or going into these communities to really see what they may be dealing with and talking to them and getting to know them so that you can,
yes.
it may open your eyes a little bit, even if you currently don't have a client within that community.
And just being aware, I think, like you said, is really important. There's like tons of work that's being done to make CBT, DBT more culturally sensitive.
Mhm.
So you gotta also assume that there's not a one size fits all model, and you don't want to be doing more harm to your client by perpetuating something that maybe was rooted in historic racism or systematic racism at all as well, because that can be very harmful too, as if you're actually doing more harm to the therapeutic
Exactly.
relationship.
And there's also look up different because, there's play therapy, right? But then if you look up, there's actually a program that teaches specifically Afrocentric play therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, you may get different types of play that again may be
Exactly.
more expressive within this community, right? You have was it triple P, right? Parenting. There's a specific triple P for black parenting, right? So looking up these different treatment models and seeing if there's other branches within other cultures of how this may look and how to utilize it.
Right. And I just preface this, and this is what I will end on, is taking a, if this is new to you and you're like listening, that's great. I always try to take CEs in areas that I'm not familiar with.
Hmm.
And like I go to, sometimes I'll go to big conference and I'll take something. And those are sometimes the smallest crowds, right? Everyone wants to see the big speaker on EMDR or some, but the best ones for me have been ones that have I was not familiar with, and I'm curious and I'm learning more. So don't just take CEs and continuing ed and stuff that you're familiar with. Try to step out and learn more about things you're not familiar. That's the whole point of continuing ed and growing as a mental health practitioner.
Yes. And like I said, if you guys are interested, I also, have some more resources and conversations on my website, which is niafamilylife.com. And then I also have an Instagram page as well, same name. So you guys
And we will link all of that so everyone can check out the resources. Just get curious. Just start checking things out. That's how you learn more. So we will link all of the resources there. But I just wanted to say, here is some resources, more resources if you are looking for scholarly articles to read on some of the different interventions to use with African Americans, some strength-based interventions for working with African Americans. Of course, we have narrative reviews here, a lot of different things. So if you're interested in checking that out, those are some of the academic resources. And I just want to wrap up by thanking you, Khadijah, for your expertise in this. And I think this was a really great starter. I mean, we could go much, much, much deeper, but I think it's a really great starter to just get people to think about working with African American clients and how they can be culturally humble and use some of these interventions and these strategies that you mentioned.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.